had the opportunity in 2003 to visit Warsaw with a lot of other World Affairs Council leaders. And one of my favorite questions to ask Europeans is, where does Europe end? And you got all sorts of interesting answers for that. I asked that question of a senior Polish diplomat in 2003, and he said, well, about halfway across Ukraine, where the churches stop becoming Catholic and start becoming Orthodox. I've never forgotten that story, and I think it resonates today. It tells us a little about what you're going to talk about tonight, and that was a prescient comment on the part of the Polish diplomat who has a lot at stake in this business as well. So we're going to now turn the panel over to some very good friends and colleagues. Dave Sacko, Vice President of Programs at the Council, my colleague at the Political Science Department at the Academy. John Gould from Colorado College and former Vice President for Programs at the Council. And my colleague, another colleague from the Air Force Academy, Dr. John Webster. And Dave Sacko, it's over to you. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm David Sacko, speaking for Colonel Webster and myself. Fortunately for you, the opinions of John and I are our own and not those of the Department of Defense. So that's a good thing. All right, Ukraine in transition. What is next for Europe's borderland? US, Russia, and Europe might like to think Ukraine is just the point of transition from Russia to Europe. Ukraine means borderland, or on the edge, and during Soviet times, Ukraine was on the edge of the Soviet Union. Russian language does not have a definite article, but in English, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was known as the Ukraine. The languages of international law, French and English, utilize a definite article when referring to an amalgamated political system like the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, or the United States, and geographic areas like the Crimea or the Rocky Mountains when there is no such political union. Thus, the entity we're referring to when we say the Ukraine had no real sovereignty, whereas today's Ukraine is very sovereign. And Ukraine is much more than Russia's edge or Europe's borderland. Today we're going to talk about where Ukraine has been, and more importantly, where we think it is headed. And again, joining me today is Professor John Gould of Colorado College. John is Associate Professor of Political Science at Colorado College, did graduate work at Fletcher and Columbia. Gould is on the board of academic advisors at the International Center of Nonviolent Conflict, of course, one of our vice presidents, and belongs to several excellent associations. Professor John Webster, my immediate left, U.S. Air Force Academy, is an intelligence officer and regional affairs strategist for the U.S. Air Force. Did his graduate work at the University of Oxford and completed military assignments on the Joint Staff at the Pentagon and at the U.S. Embassy in Helsinki, Finland, where one day he will return as ambassador. He's currently the Comparative Politics Division Chief at the Poli-Sci Department. And I'm Dr. Dave Sacko. I'm your VP in charge of programs, also professor at the Academy. I was a Fulbright scholar to Poland and have traveled to the former Soviet sphere fairly extensively. I visited Columbia and Oxford, Mississippi, and my degrees are from Binghamton and Penn State. Please help me welcome our panelists. And first up is Professor Gould.
All right, thanks, Dave, and thanks, Sky, and thank you to all for coming to this. Yeah, it's a pretty exciting time to be a Central European specialist. I was actually going to be leaving for Simferopol, Crimea in Ukraine, and then Sudak on the Black Sea coast in about 3 weeks with 15 students. Needless to say, we don't know if we arrived, even if they let our flight land at Simferopol, we don't know what visa regulations would apply, which government to apply for the visa, who would meet in the roadblocks on our way to Sudak. There are always roadblocks there. This is nothing new, but in the past it's just been normal police trying to shake people down for missing blinkers and stuff. And so needless to say, we've canceled the class. I especially decided to cancel the class after my mother called me and said, "You're not going there, are you?" So I said, if this is the way the professor's being treated by his mother, think what the students are going to have. So anyhow, Putin has cost me $5,000 of salary, unfortunately. So I've got, this is personal. No, it's, to be more honest, it's really not about me. This is really, as I told my students, this is really, really important. This is a watershed in post-Cold War history. I think it represents one of the biggest blunders in American foreign policy since 2003, and we'll come back to that in a few moments. Let's start off with the Maidan. The Maidan Square is, you know, as we call the revolution, or the uprising, I prefer to call it, in Kiev, began as a protest against the corruption and self-dealing of the Yanukovych administration. Sure, Yanukovych was democratically elected in pretty much free and fair elections, and perhaps one of the freest and fairest of all presidential elections since the fall of communism. But it didn't take long for him to show his true cards. In fact, within a year, he started to indicate that he was not planning on having another free and fair election. He instead started to show all signs of seeking political hegemony. He locked up his leading political rival, Julia Tymoshenko, in 2011. He took increasingly partisan control over the state media and used his oligarchs to purchase up and control the private media. He reestablished the 1996 Constitution, which had been amended during the last uprising of 2004. He reestablished that Constitution, essentially seizing more or less total control in the presidential administration over the country. And he also appointed cronies, Party of Regions cronies, personally loyal politicians to just about every political position in Ukraine, right down to the mayor positions. And this helped to ensure a docile parliamentary election in 2012, which was largely controlled by the Party of Regions. Okay. And in so doing, he was able to enrich himself, his family, and his allies at the expense of the broader public. And this is something that even Putin admitted to in yesterday's speech. So it's not a controversial fact. In fact, Putin basically threw Yanukovych under the bus yesterday in that speech. Now, the interesting thing is these protests started with the Yanukovych's decision to throw over a EU association agreement, and I don't think it was I think it was the weak financial offer that the European Union was giving him, promising very small loans in exchange for huge austerity and cuts in the budget. You know, that was partially painful. But to join the European Union, to be associated with the European Union, you have to adhere to certain democratic rules of the game. Right? And those democratic rules of the game were against the rules of practice that the Yanukovych regime was imposing. In fact, they could not have gotten away with what they were doing were they to continue to, become more associated with the European Union. So the European Union Association Agreement was a fundamental threat to himself and his allies. Yet, so I would say that this was a liberal revolution at start. It was for liberal purposes. But as the uprising got going, it increasingly drew heavily on radical Ukrainian nationalists. There were fewer concerns about illiberalism being expressed and more about ridding the country of its Russian and foreign interests and more about airing the grievances of the Ukrainian nation against other folks. You know, even a casual glance at some of these groups that were in the square, especially the ones that you saw, you know, manning the barricades when things got really, really tough. And you know, I'm not questioning their heroism, but if you go back to some of the politicians behind these movements, you find, very clear histories of anti-Semitism, Russophobia, Holocaust deniers, and ethnic chauvinists. And I think this is where the United States really failed miserably. You know, you think about it, if I give my kids a blank check with my little iPod here, you know, they'll come back having spent $20 upgrading their, you know, avatar in Minecraft, right? They'll just do whatever they want to it. And that's kind of the way the United States behaved towards the Maidan. We went in there and we should have set very clear guidelines, stepped back and said, listen, this is a movement, this is a serious movement to join the West, and the West has standards, the West has principles. You need to make very clear statements, first and foremost, reassuring your Russian minority, ethnic minority, which is just a bare minority in Ukraine, that everything that you do from henceforth will be based in respect for minority rights throughout Ukraine. And this was never done. The United States made no such statement. Instead, we had John McCain standing next to a known anti-Semite in the square. We had Victoria Nuland handing out donuts. We had John Kerry doing platitudes about about freedom and Western orientation. And we had a no-show from Obama, who would prefer to be anywhere but seen talking about this issue right now. So, as I said, it was a complete and total failure on the part of the Obama administration. It's interesting that there was a tape released by Nuland talking with the ambassador to Ukraine, in which they were very clearly talking about how they were going to control events and ensure the right kind of cabinet, that they had, and clearly from this discussion, there was an indication that this was about good versus bad, right? The good Ukrainians in the square versus the bad Russians across the border. And also who were represented by the Yanukovych regime. It was also clear that they thought we could manipulate events. And they were wrong on both accounts. Immediately upon the collapse of the Yanukovych regime, a number of problematic things emerged. First of all, 5 of the nationalist right wing got into top positions in the new government, the transitional government. Excuse me. These were, and these 5 were, but basically they are doing a very good job of policing their statements from the top down. They have done a very, very good effort, as the State Department has recognized, of trying to transform themselves into a contemporary nationalist right-wing parties. But at the same time, the first thing they did when the parliament met on Monday after the collapse was pass a law, get this, pass a law revoking the right of ethnic minority Russians to use the Russian language in speaking to bureaucrats in the entire Ukraine. That was immediately vetoed. Actually, it took about 48 hours, but it was vetoed by the acting president. They also made a failed attempt to get a bill decriminalizing pro-Nazi speech passed. They made an attempt to get that passed. That was immediately buried, but that effort was out there. And then you see these small little reports coming out of Ukraine. For example, just today, there was the Yanukovych holdover, an interim chief of the national television, who was essentially bullied on camera by Svoboda MPs, who bullied him physically, beat him up, until he signed a resignation letter. And there's been attacks on Yanukovych appointees throughout the Ukraine along these lines. So, that one ability to control this very, very small part of the movement has damaged the movement. And what we've gone from is a fight against tyranny of the oligarchy, which was the original fight against Yanukovych, to what I would say now is the threat, the very real threat in the eyes of ethnic Russians. I don't think it's a massive threat, but it's something that can be pulled out and pointed to, of the tyranny of the majority, of this ethnic Ukrainian majority. Let's talk about the current situation. How am I doing on time? Okay, great. Let's talk about the current situation right now. I think it's about as bad as it could be without violence. The referendum in Crimea was probably did reflect the will of the majority in Crimea, but given the conditions, how can we ever know? There was no real debate. The local parliament basically controlled the media. It cut off the internet. It blocked Kiev's media broadcasts into Simferopol and Crimea. There was no freedom of movement. There was no freedom of speech or even assembly. Many Ukrainian activists who wanted to go in there and get the word out that things were not as bad as they said in Ukraine, that Russian speakers were not being shot down in the streets as the Russian media was broadcasting in Ukraine. They went down to Kiev, and a number of them were actually kidnapped, and the borders have not been seen since. There was the Tatar activist who on March 3rd was essentially kidnapped from a peaceful demonstration in Simferopol, tortured and killed by unknown activists. But he was seen being taken by Russian militia on March 3rd. In other words, the vote in Crimea was conducted under a general sense of intimidation and menace. Most Ukrainians, most Tatars, and many pro-Ukrainian Russian youth just stayed home. They felt that there was no point in even going out to vote. As a result, we had a 97% yes vote. A 97% yes vote. As if that wasn't enough, there's also very clear evidence that where the vote was suppressed, they stuffed the ballots to make it look like there were enough people voting. There was one community that is rumored to have actually more voters than actually live in the city. You know, and you know, the kind of classic fake democracy stuff that you find in Russia in many cases. And you know, and we have to ask ourselves, why didn't Putin actually allow for a free and fair election in Crimea? Why didn't he just say, you know, let's have this in about a month? Let's protect people's freedom of speech. Let's have a free debate. Let's talk about this. You know, every single poll for the last 20 years showed that the Russians would have won, and it would have been the same result. It probably would have been about 55 to 45, but it wouldn't have been 97%. Why didn't Putin do this? And I think it, again, shows that he really does have no respect for democracy. And in fact, you see that I think that there might have been a concern that he couldn't be seen allowing Russians in Ukraine to have more rights than they have in their own country, right? So I don't think he did it. And if you actually look at what's happened since Sochi, since the beginning of this uprising heated up, you find that there has been a deepening clampdown on media, especially on internet, blogists, independent sites, independent newspapers in Russia right now. There is a growing clampdown on civil society and any kind of liberal voices whatsoever in Russia. So the oppression in Crimea is actually reflecting something that's going on back in the new homeland. And maybe that's something that actually Putin didn't want to have discussed, you know, in the lead up to the referendum. Okay, other things that are going on. There's, again, a large presence, and this is something that's actually quite frightening, large presence of irregular pro-Pan-Slavic, you know, Orthodox fighters, from Russian Cossacks to Serbian Chetniks, who are conducting roadside stops, interrogations, kidnappings, and worse. There's also going to be a new passport regime. Crimeans are allowed to apply, will all be given Russian passports, yeah, but they're allowed to keep their Ukrainian passports, but they have to apply to do it, which means they have to go through a bureaucrat to do it, which means that the bureaucrat is going to have their name and know who is loyal and who's not. So it's a again, especially for the Tatars and especially for the ethnic Ukrainians, an atmosphere of intimidation rather than one of free will or self-determination. In addition, there's also a property grab already underway. Ukrainian assets are up for grabs. The oligarch Poroshenko, who supported the Maidan, his car dealerships have already been seized by various militias in Crimea. And you know, it turns out that the cadastre records, this is rumor, I haven't confirmed it yet, but I think the cadastre records in Russia, in Crimea, are held in Kiev, which means there is no record in Crimea of who owns what, which again might mean that it's a free-for-all for bureaucrats and re-registers and stuff like that, that everybody's going to have to go through enormous bureaucratic hoops and pay bribes and prove political loyalty to hold on to their property. Okay, I have a number of things I wanted to talk to, but this is my step-out point. Maybe we can come back to some of these issues during the Q&A. What does Russia want? Well, I have a number of things that they're going to want. The first thing we have to realize is that the Crimea, despite yesterday's speech, might not be the end. Stripped of Crimea, Ukraine, any kind of adding up of the votes in Ukraine will lead to a pro-Western majority, which it didn't necessarily lead up to now. So how is Putin going to stand for that? I think he really is not going to stop until he sees Ukraine neutralized in some way. All right, and you look at their list of desires, you see that those are all going to accomplish that. The first one is that Russians need to be protected. We can come back to that. The second one is that there will be no joining EU, no joining NATO. In other words, a Finlandization of the Ukraine. There's another one, federalization of the country. You know what's happened to all the post-communist federal countries: Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, oh, Soviet Union, none of them exist anymore, but he wants to make Ukraine a federation, and another of others. But let's leave it at that, and we'll turn over to John.
Well, thank you, John. I'm going to take my comments a different slant with a little more of a historical perspective, as I'm going to focus on the concept of autonomy. Is that better? And specifically looking at the Crimea. Now, this is going to require a little bit of a review of Soviet history. So all of those Sovietologists who have been underappreciated these past 2 decades, this is your moment. And then I'm going to look at the country of Moldova, which itself is often underreported, and discuss the likelihood of Soviet aggression there. So let me start with this quick review of Soviet history. And the gist or the thrust of these comments will be that the Crimea itself is a unique political entity. And I think we have to look at this, the Soviet federal structure. And so I'm going to begin, we're going to talk about, most of you know how the Soviet Union had these 15 republics. But what we often don't talk about is it also had a series of autonomous political structures that were designated to recognize various minority nationalities within the country. And within this pseudo-federalist structure of the Soviet Union, you had four levels of autonomy. So the first was the 15 republics. But below that, you had what were called autonomous republics. So you had the 15 republics, you had 20 autonomous republics. The third level below that were autonomous oblasts, or what we would call provinces. And there were 8 of those. And then you had 10 autonomous okrugs, which were like large counties. So if you add that up, what you have is essentially over 50 nationalities that were granted some form of territorial structure with autonomy granted by the central government of the Soviet Union. Now, these groups varied widely. So you've got the Ukrainians, which themselves are the largest non-Russian nationality, 37 million. And they were granted, obviously, what was the Ukrainian Republic. But another of these 50 nationalities were the lesser-known Cherkasy, which were only 52,000, and they had their own autonomous okrug, or like a large county. And both were given these political structures for the same reason, to protect these minorities and protect their rights, not only to express themselves with language, but to give them some type of political autonomy, some type of ability of some form of self-determination. Now, something that's key to remember is that if you were a minority nationality, it didn't mean that you needed to be the majority in this territorial structure. And in fact, if you look, one great example is the Karelian Autonomous Republic, which was within the Russian Republic. Only 10% of the population were actually Karelians, ethnic Karelians. And this is, I think, key to remember, and I'll explain why. Because with this territorial autonomy, the center then bestowed specific authority to the designated region. And it was based on this recognition of some type of demographic or geographic feature. Usually, it was a minority nationality which had a historic homeland. And when looking at protections sought by nationalities who are seeking some form of self-determination, we see on the more benign, on the left side, would be some type of equal rights protection, or maybe cultural autonomy. If we go to the much harsher, it would be some form of confederal structure or actual independence, a sovereign state. And what the Soviets did is they took kind of the middle ground, this territorial autonomy, which they granted to these different groups. And now these institutional structures had significance, and while actual political power vary depending on the period of time in the Soviet Union. There were various times when they worked very hard to develop cultural heritage of these particular nationalities, and activities would range from state-sponsored festivals to different publications to even schools were established where the language that was taught was this nationality's language. Now this is particularly important in Crimea. In 1921, the Crimean Autonomous Republic was formed and became part of the Soviet Union. Now this was due to, in fact, this unique demographic and geographic feature. So you've got the Crimean Tatars, who are a unique minority, and you have their historic homeland, which is the Crimean Peninsula. Now, after integration into the Soviet Union, the Tatars experienced different levels of persecution and sometimes prosperity, but more of the former than the latter. And at the end of the war, due to how things turned out, Stalin directed the Tatars be deported, and they resettled them as they were being charged with as being conspirators with the Nazis, and they were declared enemies of the state. At that time, when the Crimean Tatars are all deported, the Crimean Autonomous Republic lost its status, right? It was no longer needed. And in fact, what happened is that region, Crimean Peninsula, becomes just a regular province or county within Russia. It no longer had a special autonomous status. Now, in 1954, Khrushchev transfers this region, the Crimean Peninsula, back to the Ukraine. And there's various reasons for this, but in reality, no one knows exactly why. Some say it was in recognition of the 300th anniversary of the unification of Ukraine and Russia. That's one explanation. In 1967, a Soviet decree was issued that removed the charges of being enemies of the state against the Tatars, but they were never formally resettled back to their homeland until kind of the last days of the Soviet Union. Now this is, for those of you that are true Sovietologists, this is an interesting period. Gorbachev, who is struggling to gain more power and he's trying to find a way to minimize the strength of the Communist Party, starts creating different institutional structures within the Soviet Union, and he changes the Supreme Soviet. And in doing so, while he's trying to wrest power away from the Communist Party, he actually opens up opportunities for other groups to gain access to the Soviet agenda. And some of those groups are these nationalities within the Soviet Union that feel like they have not been properly treated. Two of those groups, which are of interest, are the Crimean Tatars, right, who come back onto the national stage, and they make a request to the Supreme Soviet, and this is in 1989, we'd like a reinstatement of our autonomous status. Another group is in neighboring Moldova, and these are the Gagauz, who also are Turkic people, however, a different group, and they are complaining that they have no autonomous status, and that they should, looking around to their neighbors that do. And so through a variety of means, legislative process, both these groups get their voices heard, and in 1991, before the end of the Soviet Union, the Crimeans actually get their status back. And so we have the reinstatement of the autonomous Crimean Republic, but this time it's within Ukraine. So with the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine becomes an independent state, and Crimea is an autonomous republic within that state, within that country. And gradually, we see institutional structures developed again. And these include a constitution, a parliament, and a council of ministers. And this is important because these structures have a mobilizing effect on the local population. And we've seen them highlighted in the media as this discussion of, is this legal based on what the Crimean Constitution says? And we have these pictures in front of the Crimean Parliament building. And this highlights this unique situation of the Crimea and its tenuous relationship with Kiev. So you may say, so what? Why does this autonomy matter? Well, it's significant because it shows that Crimea itself is a unique territorial entity with legitimate state institutions and power structures. And since the reinstatement of the autonomous republic, there's been constant rumblings regarding Crimea's allegiances. These include calls, past calls, and this is post-Ukrainian independence, calls to reunite with Russia, calls to become an independent country of themselves, or to have at least more autonomy within Ukraine. So the bonds with the center, with Kiev, were already weak. And second, the key point, I think, is this makes Crimea an easy target for Russia. Its history, its geography, its political structures, its demography lowered the threshold for Russia to violate Ukraine's state sovereignty. And when viewed in this context, I think, and I argue, that this makes Russia's actions less threatening than a blatant territorial grab. And it argues the point that all annexations are not created equal. We'll get to that. So the second point. So the question in our title is what's next for Europe's borderland? So then we move to Moldova. And what's interesting, I spent some time in Moldova 2000, 2001, and I was there with the U.S. Embassy, and our mission was to foster democracy. And while we were there, they held an election, and the Moldovan Communist Party was led by a man by the name of Vladimir Voronin. He led a campaign with this campaign slogan, "I promise to make Moldova the Cuba of Europe." So we at the embassy thought, oh, this is good news. This is good news. We're gonna win here, and democratic forces are going to prevail. And indeed, we were proven wrong. Voronin sailed to victory, took over, and the Communist Party of Moldova took charge, and he turned Moldova from the west to the east. So several commentaries have been raised about the prospects of Russia's expansion further west. And if you accept this premise, one likely location would be the Republic of Moldova, mainly because it has two breakaway republics, or two breakaway regions. One is Transnistria, and another is a region called Gagauzia, which David pointed out was even mentioned on the Diane Rehm show. Now, Gagauzia, I've spent a bit of time studying and interviewing Gagauz leaders, and just to hear its name on national news was quite exciting. And it's interesting, I think, and I'll argue why, it's not a good example. So in Moldova, although it straddles Romania and Ukraine, it has struggled since its independence in 1991. It reached a legislative solution for the Gagauz in 1995 by doing what? By doing what they had seen done previously, creating territorial autonomy. And they gave that to the Gagauz. However, Transnistria has been acting independent of Moldova since the ceasefire was signed in 1992. So I'm going to examine a couple, just quickly, in my 2 minutes, why I think it's unlikely that we're going to see intervention there. The first is Transnistria, which is, if you don't know, it's just a thin strip of territory on the eastern side of the Dniester River, remains today under Russian influence. Remnants of the Soviets' 14th Army are still there under the role or under the guise of being peacekeepers. Recent news reports estimate that Russia pays Transnistria almost $30 million annually to keep it under its influence. In reality, there's been very little change in the past 2 decades. And so while Moldova has indeed fluctuated from pro-Russia, pro-EU governments, it hasn't changed the relationship between Russia and Transnistria, or the relationship between Moldova and Transnistria. And I think it's important to understand that the status quo right now suits Russia. In a zero-sum game of Russian foreign policy, there would be no need for them to act unless they were forced to react. They've got locally entrenched leverage, and they're going to keep it. I also think Russia's unlikely to engage in Gagauzia. And I say this even though it was recently reported that the Gagauz is Moscow's fifth column. Let me quote, "The Kremlin is using the Gagauz to loosen Europe's grasp on Moldova." But in the reality, the Gagauz, who are ethnically Turks, have no natural affinity to the Russians. In fact, 20 years ago, they were just looking for someone to look out for them, and Turkey stepped up because Turkey had, and this is 91, Demirel was the president. They were looking to become kind of a greater regional power. They came in and they established these Turkic roots, but for various reasons, they've lost this Turkish support. The Moldovans haven't done a very good job of implementing this territorial autonomy, and they're just looking for help improving their economic situation. But even, I would argue, unhappy Gagauz does not make an aggressive Russian takeover likely. So let me close with two key points. The first is, I think in the way ahead, I think Moldova is a country that Ukraine can learn from. Moldova has lived peaceably alongside Transnistria for the past 2 decades. After they broke up with that disastrous civil war in 1992, there's not been any bloodshed. The two have worked out agreements. They figured out how to, due to pragmatism, how to avoid confrontation. It's been a conscious policy not to antagonize one another. And with using this model, I believe Ukraine can live peaceably alongside Crimea. But they'll have to accept the inevitable introduction, as John mentioned, by Crimea of border security measures, visa requirements, currency changes. And I've traveled from Moldova to Transnistria. You think you're going into another country. Different license plates, currency, a parliament, governor, everything. But they've learned to deal with it. Keeping an eye towards peaceful coexistence on the long term rather than the short-term perspective of needing to avenge unjust wrongs. And the second point would be is I think the U.S. should be careful not to make sweeping generalizations about a new aggressive Russia. As I discussed earlier, I think Crimea was a unique geopolitical entity, and after the loss of the Russian-backed Yanukovych, it was natural to expect Putin to counter. And as we looked along Russia's eastern border, Crimea was low-hanging fruit. It was an easy win. And Putin, after suffering a loss, needed a win, and he got it. And I'll leave with that.
So it's my task to talk about the European reaction. If it is the case that Putin has stopped going as far as Crimea, and what can we do? What can the West do to secure the space for the Ukrainian democracy to thrive? What can the West do to assure Ukraine's security? So in terms of the U.S. reaction, not a whole lot. We don't have a whole lot of economic levers. In the Russian economy, which is about $2 trillion, last year we traded about $26 billion, which puts us between Belarus and the Republic of Korea. So not so much. The EU, on the other hand, is $370 billion last year, and that doesn't include the Brits. So if we want to talk about the economic levers that we could press, it's primarily a European question. So what can we expect from the Europeans? What can we expect from them? So it kind of gets to the question, well, what do we mean by European? Can we really reasonably talk in terms of European rational foreign policy? And going into this crisis, I would say no, absolutely not. But perhaps with this crisis, as this crisis has been evolving, we actually are seeing the beginnings of a unified strategic thinking based foreign policy from the Europeans. Of course, when we talk about the Europeans, we can usually think about some of the big IGOs over there in terms of the EU, maybe even NATO, or their European major powers like the United Kingdom, Germany, or France. I'm going to go back to an older distinction, this maybe not quite so popular, but in thinking about Europe in terms of old versus new. And of course, that was popularized by Mr. Rumsfeld. We didn't get his way going into Iraq. But if we think about it a little bit more carefully, in my mind, it makes a little bit more sense. When we think about old Europe, we're talking about those European powers, those European states that started the thing. The European coal and steel community back in 1947, which was largely France, Germany, and Belgium. Those are the older European states. And then the new Europe, we talk about the newer consolidated democracies, mainly the former Soviet sphere kinds of states. I mean, you know, the Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and then the new southern European states, Bulgaria, Romania, and the former Yugoslavian republics. So in that sense, we can think about some solid preferences, some ways of dealing with international relations writ large going into the crisis. That the old Western Europeans see threats to their security largely in terms of climate change, human trafficking, and maybe a nuisance level of terror. There are pieces attainable in their time. They're close. They've come so far. They no longer think of NATO as an important club since their part of the world seems pretty benign, you know, non-threatening and assured of continued invulnerability so long as multinational organizations reign and the EU is viable as an economic actor, that solutions are primarily economic in nature. You know, by and large, we're talking about Germany and France, who are surrounded by fairly pliant neighbors and reminders of past horrors and are strongly motivated to avoid any repetition of such calamities. They place their trust in multilateralism, in international organizations, further embrace further European integration and this kind of Kantian expectation that the universal embrace of pacifism will unite everybody. It's a great thought. Following the Georgian invasion, they were less anxious about tensions with Russia than they were about the chance that such tensions could lead to cutoff in natural gas and, you know, those factors that were fueling their economy. After the Georgian invasion, there were no sanctions, largely for these reasons. On the other hand, these newly consolidated democratic Europe types of countries worry about whether they can deal purposefully with Russia. They remember the Soviet Union very well. And they see NATO and its security guarantees as inseparable for their continued independence. Even those who did not view Russia's invasion of Georgia as a return to military competition still see a growing threat from Moscow in terms of the energy weapon. You know, the Poles remember a pretty cold winter not too far back. Polish officials particularly worry that Russia has decided that the reassertion of great power status is more important than their integration with the West. So you have these two different perspectives. You might say, I might say, that Russia's annexation of the Crimea represents the perfect storm to unite both these perspectives, both new and old Europe, albeit for very different reasons. In broad terms, speaking like an international relations theorist, old Europe takes a complex interdependence view of world politics, looking at my students over there, complex interdependence fellows, yep. And perhaps inspired by this Kantian philosophical view, where newly democratized Europe represents a more realist view of world politics, perhaps inspired by a more Hobbesian, Thomas Hobbes kind of perspective. Where in New Europe, Poland and the Baltic states, particularly Estonia, with its large Russian ethnic population and its own allegations of neo-Nazis living among the ethnic Estonians, view the incursion of Russian paramilitary forces into the Crimea and the massive forces on Ukraine's border with the possible loss of other Ukrainian territory as a fundamental altering of the balance of power in the region. For them, it's about power and security. It's power and security. What makes old Europe old is a continuing dedication and reliance on the project of European integration and multilateralism. This is a good thing. Sometimes it is good to be old. If the EU itself does not extend into Ukraine, it is key to old European ideology that at least the EU's ideas of free trade and institutional governance do. On this note, the crisis in Ukraine was predicated by Yanukovych's rejection of the EU deal offering Ukraine the association agreement. This was a big deal to, again, a lot of the integrationists. Thus, finally, in Europe, old and new have the possibility for strategic convergence on foreign policy, particularly as it relates to Russia. Up to this point, Europeans thinking together and for the long term have been an exception and not the rule. National or ideological positions have prevailed over common ones. New Europe is more motivated by security, old Europe more by international law, but nonetheless, you can see a strategic convergence. So, military solution at this point, a European military solution, utterly unthinkable. They can't do it. They don't want to do it and they can't do it. So again, we're back to the economic question. Both old and new European states are dependent on Russian energy or benefit greatly from Russian money in their financial institutions. The EU's created and maintained a common position up to this point that Russia's incursion into Crimea was illegal, have together engaged in intensive diplomacy, and backed it up with the three-step sanctions regime. So we're on step 2 so far. 2 steps have been implemented, and significant funds have been dedicated to Ukraine for it to avoid it going bankrupt while keeping all 28 member states on board. This is huge for the Europeans. I would even say unprecedented in the current state of the EU. Step 1, going back a little bit, was enacted on March 6th, and that's ending closer economic ties. It cuts visas between Russia and the EU, or free visas, and ceased G8 preparations in Sochi, the upcoming meeting in Sochi. Limited but symbolic, and it maintained unanimity, so they build up a head of steam. Step 2 was just announced this week. Those were the targeted sanctions. There's a list of individuals associated with the takeover. Among them were Dmitry Rogozin, who is known as the Tsar of modernization. A big deal in the Russian economy and the Russian military, Russian society, is modernization. And Mr. Rogozin is at the center of it. When we talk about people who are of interest, Rogozin is one of them. So 21 individuals, there's a list of 120 that the EU started with, and it got down to 21. That is progress. The U.S. has issued sanctions against 11 of those. Yesterday, the European Parliament added 32 Russian officials who were sanctioned, mirroring the U.S. Magnitsky sanctions that were put into place last year. So the list is growing. We expect it to grow even more. Step 3 we'll probably get to next week. Step 3 for the sanctions. President Obama has invited the leaders of the G7 to meet in the Netherlands next week, and they're going to discuss what the next step for sanctions are. And it should involve far-reaching consequences, including a broad range of economic areas. We're thinking this might include exclusion from the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, possibly including import-export bans, which starts to get very tricky. If the EU program is going to break down, it's going to break down there. And that's going to be it. So that we're waiting to see what will happen there. So if Europe is to maintain a consistent and cohesive sanctions regime, this would be a major victory for how it does things. And we could begin to really cohesively talk about Europe. We could talk about European preferences. When it comes down to assessing how well Europe is doing, all eyes are on Germany, in terms of it being the economic powerhouse, and Germany having the closest ties to Russia going in beforehand. Ms. Merkel has declared that Germany would tolerate the costs that EU sanctions against Moscow would likely inflict on a country's own economy. These were words that were just as much targeted to Mr. Putin as they were targeted to the German business community that makes a lot of money in Russia. German newspapers are starting to come around. There have been all sorts of pro-EU action in the German papers, and the French papers, and the Spanish papers, and the places that were typical of old Europe are starting to see support. And of course, there's all kinds of support for tough economic sanctions in New Europe. It's possible that the EU will fail disastrously in Ukraine. We almost expect it, but hey, even a blind squirrel finds a nut. It is perhaps even likely, given the odds, but they've come quite a distance. The other IGO really quickly to consider is NATO, obviously. Russia's actions are predicated on several perceived incursions in its territory, notably NATO expansion. In 2008, I think John mentioned, there was talk of a membership action plan for both Georgia and Ukraine, and that's what it was. It was an invitation to be invited and the Bucharest Memorandum. NATO had expanded as far as the Baltic states into 2004, obviously Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary before that, and then to the south in between. We see NATO, we the West, see NATO as an organization first for collective defense, but also to provide a pool of ready resources should there be a contingency operation that requires it, but also to teach militaries to be nice, for how to be a military within a liberal democracy, that there are several domestic requirements to be a member. It's good to be a member. And we see largely NATO as a benign organization. Russia sees NATO as the organization that was created to counter its interests, and has been countering its interests since it was created all the way up to today. No question. That's about power projection first and security second, and that it will expand until it is at its front doorstep, and it will simply not allow that. That's how it sees NATO. So given the military actions by NATO, the 12 F-16s and the AWACS sent to fly over Poland, the F-15s to Lithuania, the reemphasis of ballistic missile defense in Poland and Romania, the USS Truxtun exercising with Bulgaria and Romania as we speak in the Black Sea, and considering ground exercises in the Baltics, these are all signals that are certainly perceived by Russia, certainly perceived very, very clearly. While NATO has not had the lack of focus on the EU, the situation in the Baltic has refocused it as well in terms of how Brussels and Mons, Belgium, the headquarters there, begin to see the strategic situation. This has given them, as a European organization, a great deal of clarity as well. So the Russian takeover of the Crimea, at the end of the day, may have the unanticipated consequence of changing Europe's political focus as much as it has changed Ukraine's geography, and unifying both the EU and clarifying NATO's purpose in ways not seen since the end of the Cold War. And with that, we're ready to take some questions. Yes, sir. So if you can give me the question, I'll repeat it so we have it for the camera. Okay. So thinking about why Mr. Putin does what he does, there is a number of domestic imperatives upon him, but he also has a fairly particular way of looking at the world. I'll just start the comment and run down here. There's a very good book by Cliff Gaddy and Fiona Hill, former contemporary of John's, that looks at the four Putins, the four ways that Mr. Putin seems to present himself as a KGB case officer, as a statist, someone who sees the power in the state, as someone who sees beauty in the Russian civilization, and then I forget the fourth one, but you have to check out the book. But that's the question, in terms of understanding what is his geopolitical game here.
Yeah, well, I'm not quite sure what the question was. I mean, but the point here, though, is that actually I would encourage you all to read at least a summary of the transcript from his speech yesterday, because I don't think it was all just smoke and mirrors and propaganda and bluster. I think it was actually a true, deeply felt summary of the concerns of moderate nationalists, and I'm saying moderate nationalists in Russia over the last few years. And again, you see that this crisis in terms of Putin's own popularity at home has been gold. I mean, he's never been as popular as he is right now. And this is like 3 years ago, you had the Snow Revolution, right? So I think that being able to articulate those long-standing grievances, that feeling that the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, was a chance to take us in as an equal partner, and yet you guys being the West, have taken every single promise, every single chance to put us down, and you've never let up, and we're not going to take it anymore. We're now finally standing up for ourselves. And you go about it, I mean, the litany will start off with Bush's promise to Gorbachev that NATO wouldn't go any further east. Well, Clinton took care of that in 1999. Took into account Nixon and Kissinger's promise to Brezhnev never to pursue a anti-ballistic missile defense. Well, Bush took care of that in 2001 and then implemented an anti-ballistic missile system in Poland and the Czech Republic, right? Which that Obama took back, right? And then of course, both the United States after 2001 and Russia share a terrorist problem, Putin was the first person to reach out to Bush after the 9/11. One of the first people to reach out to Bush after 9/11 and offer support and help. He expected a reciprocity in Chechnya. Well, of course, the Russian conduct in Chechnya was abominable, and the Bush administration could not possibly countenance that. But again, they felt betrayed, right? The whole point of the reset was, of Obama's reset was to do away with that. That's, we are now going to treat you as an equal power. Interest is interest. We're going to recognize each other's interests. We're going to, we're not going to, betray you. And yet, here in this one case, in the Maidan, you see, again, the United States clearly interfering in the internal politics of a sovereign state. And again, the Putin administration comes out and says, that's a clear violation of the agreement that we had in 1994 to respect Ukraine's sovereignty. So we are now able to do that. So there's been a very, very clear statement of grievances by Putin. It was given yesterday. I urge you to read it. It'll get you into the mindset. If you want to read a little bit more summary, I would urge just reading our own David Hendrickson from up in Colorado College. He has a series of articles in the last week in National Interest that have been really, really, really good, providing kind of a neutral, realist point of view in which Russia's security concerns are taken seriously. If you want to take the other side and look at a really probably the most articulate presentation of the perspective of the Maidan and the perspective of Ukrainians right now, Ukrainian moderates, I would urge you to read Timothy Snyder, who's got an article coming out tomorrow in the New York Review of Books. So National Interest, Timothy Snyder. And then if you want a daily dose of more articles in translation from Russia than you can handle, go read Johnson's Russia list. It's on the web every single day, and he just has 20, 30 articles. This will really, really give you much, much more information than you ever could have possibly wanted. But I go to Snyder and Hendrickson give you the kind of opposing views here.
So I would completely agree with you. I was at the Pentagon in 2008 with the Russia-Georgia conflict. And if I was Putin and I watched the U.S. reaction to that and what transpired afterwards, I would do just what you said. I'd weather this storm, wait for things to calm down. The U.S. and the EU will mourn Crimea's loss, and after the period of mourning is over, things will go back to normal. I think that's what he expects.
Just to repeat the question, is partition for Ukraine a solution here in terms of going forward and Ukrainian stability? Seemed to work in Czechoslovakia, not so much with Sudan. What about Ukraine? John?
Okay, I'm not so sure I can handle that question, not knowing exactly what Eastern Ukrainians are thinking. It's, you do have this very, very odd kind of complex set of identities. You have ethnic Ukrainians who speak Ukrainian. You have ethnic Ukrainians who speak Russian. You have ethnic Russians who speak Russian. And then you have, Crimeans. And so, these groups are really, really mirrored, mixed in together, especially as you go further east. It's difficult to say what the ethnic Russians and the Russian-speaking Ukrainians would want. I have the sense that there is an attempt by Russian nationalists, many of whom have been bussed in from across the border, to create hard categories of us and them, Russian and not Russian. And you find the same thing mirrored in, efforts by Pravy Sektor and Svoboda, these Ukrainian nationalist groups in the East. And I think Ukraine's civil society is sophisticated enough to resist such efforts. And therefore, I think they would be not only against an invasion, an imposition of Russian national armies on Ukrainian sovereignty, but I also think they would be against any kind of artificial efforts to divide Russian-speaking Ukrainians from Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians.
I think it would be very problematic. And considering the history of partitions, have to think about India and Pakistan, have to, of course, Sudan. The case of the Czech Republic and Slovakia comes to mind as a peaceful example, but there you had, again, two groups that for a long time had known each other, coexisted under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and cobbled together at different points for political convenience, and then just as politically convenient, without high nationalism, asked to be separately sovereign units, knowing that their future had a relatively similar trajectory. So I think the case of Czechoslovakia is a very special one. And of course, they have international organizations like the EU that were helping their development along as well. Partition concerns me a great deal as a political scientist, thinking about how nationalism can be manipulated and abused, and particularly in this kinds of case. And again, spent a lot of time in Kiev, and it's a beautiful city. And one of the beautiful things was that it was, you had a majority Russian speakers, but they spoke, it was almost this form of Spanglish, where, I was trying to learn Russian, and I would follow along for a while, and then they'd switch to Ukrainian, then switch back to Russian, and then switch to another language. And it was all perfectly fine, that it wasn't that there was Ukrainians living on one side of the block and Russians on the other. It was they were very much part of each other's culture. They're part of each other's culture, so it'd be very, very difficult to divide. I would like to be able to, divide things neatly and, give the West to the EU and the East to the Eurasian Union, but I'm afraid it's not that simple. Not that simple.
Yeah. I mean, just earlier this week, there was a speech by Khodorkovsky, the formerly jailed Russian oligarch who was released before the Olympics, and he gave the speech in Russian in the Maidan. And a huge crowd turned out to hear him speak. And of course, he was critical of Putin as they'd expected, but at the end, the crowd, who were Russian-speaking Ukrainians and Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, chanted Slavia Russia. Did I say that right? Slavia Russia, glory to Russia, glory to Russia. Right? In other words, they were indicating that, that really the language isn't that important. It's, there's something else going on here.
Yeah, Russia and its pesky UN Security Council veto. Anytime the international community seems to want to do something, there's either Russia, China, or us blocking it. So this pesky UN Security Council. John?
Well, I'm reminded when Ambassador Rice, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, previous to the current one, who Samantha Powers, when they tried to pass the first resolution to condemn Syria, and this is 2.5 years ago, and deaths had, I think, were only in the tens of thousands, maybe 15,000. And they did an interview with her after the Russians vetoed the resolution. And the Chinese also did, I should note. And you could just see how upset and angry she was. And she used very strong, undiplomatic language. And it reminded me that the system is just designed such that it becomes paralyzed. And the reality is you cannot reform the UN Security Council without the consent of the Permanent Five of the UN Security Council. So what I've seen, I'm sure we all have, read about different resolutions, and the Kofi Annan, he led this effort to reorganize it and to change the power structure, and India's called for that, and Brazil, and we've got this World War II relic trying to govern a 21st century world, and until you get Russia on board to agree, it's just not going to happen. That's my view.
Fantastic question. Moving forward, how can the WTO possibly compel Russia to change its behavior? And I'll start off. One of the other aspects of the Magnitsky Accountability Act, which was the first act to levy smart sanctions against individuals who were in Russia, who were human rights abusers associated with the death of Sergei Magnitsky, who was a human rights advocate in Russia, who died in custody, was detained for a year, and had some medical conditions that weren't attended to, and he died. And he's representative of a few other cases. So there was the U.S. Senate, as you know, right after Mr. Obama began his reset, the U.S. Senate began to advocate to take a tougher line with Russia. And it was Mr. Kerry, who was just going from his job in the Senate to the Secretary of State, who managed to get the Magnitsky Accountability Act watered down a little bit, mainly symbolic. But the underside to that was to loosen the economic restrictions in place since the Jackson-Vanik Act of the 70s on Russia, which we had inherited from the Soviet Union. So it was a long project in our foreign policy to attempt to integrate Russia into the world economy. And the thinking being that the more that Russia is integrated in the world economy, the more restrained it will be. The more it will feel capital flight and the stock market hit when the World Economic Community doesn't like what it's doing and it takes its capital out or it divests. So this has been an important track of U.S. foreign relations in dealing with Russia to try and get them more integrated globally. Big part being the WTO. So you might say, well, if we undo that, then maybe that's Mr. Putin and Russia's hand, that by making Russia more isolated economically, it will still have somebody to buy its gas and oil. If it's not the EU, it'll be China. It certainly will get bought by someone. But by excluding Russia from the World Trade Organization, that cuts them off from a lot of the kind of other sorts of layers that we think would be important. So I haven't seen a good explanation of exactly how that would work. Again, the current level of sanctions right now are individuals. They're not allowed to travel. Some of their financial assets have been frozen. A guy lost his apartments in New York. Tough on him. But then the next level, the next week, they're going to roll that out. So stay tuned. Now, I'm very interested to see how that would work. You guys have any insights? One over there, and then work our way there. Oh, another good question. So what does the Russian Federation citizens think about this? Is the incursion in Crimea a popular act? And if they don't like it in the Russian system, what can the Russian citizens do about it?
No, you go first.
Yeah, that's a huge question. It depends on which Russian citizens you're talking about. There's huge differences throughout the post-communist world between the rural and the urban, between the educated, the less educated, and between the young and the elderly. And you find divisions on issue after issue breaking down along those lines. I don't know enough about how the message of the Russian propaganda machine is perceived to actually say how that breaks out. Last week at the beginning of the occupation, we did have well over 10,000 Muscovites marching, and a large number also marching in in St. Petersburg against the expansion of Russia. That was reported in the national press as a small demonstration of 3,000. And we saw the pictures. There were 10 to 50,000 there in the streets. But I'm sure that the truth is somewhere in between. There was also a counter demonstration of people, wearing red suits, asking for, a return to the Soviet Union. There is no what I would call, there was no what I would call a broad cross-national movement for liberalization in that country. It tends to be, the liberal message tends to be confined, I would even say ghettoized, to the major cities, especially to Moscow. And you also have to realize that these are the people that Putin made, right? That he kind of stabilized expectations, stabilized the rule of law enough to allow a middle class to start flourishing in these cities. They did extraordinarily well in the boom years, the boom oil years of 2000 to 2008 before the crisis. And Putin's looking at them and saying, and now they betray me. Now they want to liberalize. Now they're rejecting everything I've stood for. So, and that message is also kind of wrapped into an overall cultural war of who's a real Russian patriot and what does patriotism mean, right? We have red states and blue states. They have, the foreign-oriented Western agents who were really supporting the pro-homosexual agenda, and I'm seriously, that's the language they use, right? And then the real true patriots who are masculine men who are ready to, fight for the nation on the drop of a hat and, and intolerant of Western ideas like homosexuality and kind of orthodox and religious and so on. And, that's a massive, massive simplification, but it does come down, there's this kind of crude propaganda messages in the battle. So, I'll move on.
Is the present definition of the territory of Ukraine, post-Crimea, I would assume, viable as a nation state? Viable as a nation state?
Go ahead. Please give it a shot.
That's an interesting question. I just don't see any argument against it. One of the agreement that Dave mentioned that was signed, I think it was the British, the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine in '94 was to recognize the borders. And those borders of Ukraine, I'm thinking about the one I'm most familiar with along Moldova, are almost all established post World War II, right 45, 46. And there's not a lot of clamoring to change them. You would know on the Polish side, but on the Moldovan side, what was interesting was that, just a little history because you've opened it up. After World War I, Romania expanded into Greater Romania, and because Russia was weak and the Russian Empire was weak, Romania expanded and took part of Russian territory, which is modern-day Moldova. And the Russians were upset, and so to react to this, they created this autonomous region of Moldova and carved it out of Ukraine along the Dniester River, the eastern part of the Dniester River, as a symbolic statement to say, okay, Moldovans who want to be part of the Soviet Union, here's a homeland for you to come to. And then post-World War II, with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they divided up Romania back into its pre-World War I borders and gave that eastern slice back to the Soviet Union. And in post-World War II, they created the Moldovan Republic and gave it a little bit of that slice of Ukraine, and that is what is modern-day Transnistria. And one reason why it broke away, it never was originally part of Moldova. And so from that part, you can see playing with borders is dangerous business, right? It causes uncertainties that have effects that we're feeling today. Now you have this frozen conflict of Transnistria because of that manipulation of the border post-World War II. Now, does Ukraine have similar unstable borders with its neighbors, Lithuania and Poland and Russia? I don't know, and I'll turn that to Dave.
No. The Ukrainians and the Poles had been fighting for 1,000 years. One of the cities in hot contention is what the Poles called Lviv, and the Ukrainians call Viv. And it's a beautiful city, Polish architecture. The Poles accept that that is now in Ukraine. That the Poles, by and large, have been taking sort of a big brother role ideologically in terms of the way that Ukraine should move forward in terms of how to be a market-based liberal democracy. So things are hunky-dory more or less along the western border. It's just this kind of recent issue that has caused problems. So I think it's okay.
Yeah, and again, a lot of the stuff that I was talking about earlier on is that there are attempts by various extreme nationalists on both sides to create hard categories. In other words, us and them nations, the Ukrainian national, nation, or the Russian nation. And one of the options that Putin seems to be reserving is the effort to create disturbances in the East that would give credence to his assertion that Russian speakers and ethnic Russians are at risk in eastern Ukraine, in which case he therefore will reserve the right to go in there and protect that Russian ethnic nation, and thereby carve that Russian ethnic nation out from the Ukrainian Russian-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking nation, if you see what I mean. So really, a nation-state is a political construct. Right now, the Maidan and the victors in the square are fighting to preserve the image of a nation's state that actually in which many different ethnicities can cooperate and continue to live together as they have been, completely peacefully, right? And feeling safely, but there are forces on both sides that are pulling at that and trying to change that narrative, and that's really politically quite dangerous.
And I am afraid we are out of time. Sorry. One more. The new prime minister, does he represent the extremist sect? And what did he get from meeting President Obama?
Okay, this is Yatsenuk, and he is from Fatherland Party. This is the party of Julia Tymoshenko. They're essentially a mainstream party. Julia Tymoshenko is a Ukrainian nationalist. She speaks Russian. Okay, so she's not, and so this is really the voice of moderate Ukrainian identity creation, right? And Yats is Jewish. Right? Yatsenyuk is Jewish. He plays that down because there's an extraordinary anti-Semitic history in the western part of the state, as well as throughout the Slavic world. But he is clearly the representative of a kind of a multi-ethnic state. If you actually look at the government, I mean, not only do you have this very small group of 5, a government is huge, right? And I perhaps did everybody a disservice by overly focusing on 5, but that's because that's been such a politically potent image. Of these people from the group Svoboda and Pravi Sektor, right? But by and large, the composition of the current government is truly multi-ethnic, and in that way is actually representative of the Ukrainian nation state. Yeah.
The prime minister was in the old government, correct?
Yeah, he was. What did he get? I didn't follow the talks.
It remains to be seen. I did not see any tangible benefit either. But how about I check and get back to you? Yeah.
Maybe he got a selfie with the president. I don't know.
That was before. Yeah, they have 16 billion coming. Thank you, everybody. We're really, let's thank our panelists one last time. And I would like to thank Wells Fargo Private Bank very much for their support. Have a great night, everybody.